All right, we are live. Hey folks, I'm Jack.
I'm Liam.
We're part of Fall 2019 EWB, and we're going to be talking about the Bangladesh water crisis, a lesson in failed international development. Let's jump right in. So to give a roadmap of our presentation, we're going to talk about a little bit of the project background, then the project development. We're going to talk about the immediate aftermath and the response from the government and the international community. And then we're going to talk about the long-term failure of this project and the legacy of that failure. And then we'll wrap up with lessons for Engineers Without Borders. And just to talk a little bit about why we chose this project, I think we were both really interested because the Bangladesh water crisis was a result of failed development, whereas a lot of the crises we see around the world are a result of a lack of development.
So just to start off by giving a brief overview of the country of Bangladesh. It's located in southern Asia, right next to India. It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world, with nearly 3,000 people per square mile. That puts it as one of the top 10 most densely populated countries in the world. Its economy is largely based on agriculture, so there's a lot of rice fields and similar crops like that. And it's also in a location that has a pretty heavy yearly monsoon season, which affects the agricultural industry throughout the country because a lot of areas can be prone to flooding, especially in the rural areas. And this, throughout the history of the country, has also influenced how a lot of waterborne diseases have been able to spread throughout the population.
Sweet, thanks, Liam. So a look at pre-development Bangladesh. So the primary source of water was surface water, but the problem was this was highly contaminated with pathogens. So they had very high rates of cholera and other diseases. And it was estimated that in the 1970s, there were about 2.5 million deaths per year due to these waterborne diseases. That's out of a total population of 70 million. It's about 160 million nowadays. But clearly, there were lots of problems with the current water sources.
So just to go over how this project sort of started, the main international effort was led by UNICEF, which, as we know, is a really big international organization. And their goal was to come in and hopefully solve a lot of these problems that the people of the country were experiencing with these waterborne diseases. So to do this, they wanted to try and find an alternate water source to just the surface water that was common at the time. So their strategy was going to be to drill wells and use groundwater to provide this new clean water source that hopefully would reduce the rates of these diseases for a lot of the rural population.
Sweet. So if you've ever wondered where your Halloween UNICEF money goes, here's a quick look. So between 1970 and 1990, over 11 million shallow wells were built in Bangladesh, serving an estimated 80% of the rural population. This was primarily a rural problem. The cities had different water sources, and they were not targeted for these projects. The wells were very simple in design. They were about 1.5-inch PVC wells, 8 or 10 meters deep, with hand pumps. So they were able to be installed pretty quickly. And like I said, they installed over 11 million in these in just a couple decades.
And because they were able to install so many so quickly, generally, it was initially viewed as a success when they first implemented the project. The rates of deaths due to cholera and other similar waterborne type diseases were significantly reduced, especially for infants, young people, elderly, which greatly helped the rural population throughout the country. And UNICEF even released a statement saying that they had reached their goal of providing safe drinking water to 80% of the rural population, which obviously they viewed as a great success, and I think in general the international community thought was a really good thing to start. And the British Geological Survey even conducted quite a few water quality surveys throughout the country, and most of these came back clean. But the problem, unfortunately, at that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, arsenic was not a chemical being commonly tested for in general water quality tests. So at first, they didn't realize that this prevalence of arsenic was actually going to become a pretty significant problem for the people of Bangladesh. So once they eventually realized this, it was a little too late to just fix all the wells that they had drilled. And we can see that even today, in this map here, there's a pretty significant percentage of people who still drink from contaminated wells throughout the country, in these regions shown in red, especially in rural areas. And today it's nearly a quarter of the population, about 40 million people still drinking from contaminated wells.
So before we talk too much about arsenic, I wanted to give a brief overview of what arsenic is. So it's a toxic element, and it's naturally occurring in the environment. So it is also produced from mining and various industrial processes. But in the case of Bangladesh, it's a completely natural contaminant. On the right, you can see a map of natural hotspots of arsenic. And there's only a few, but Bangladesh is right in the middle of one of them. And as Liam said, it was only recognized as a threat really in the 1980s. It had been known about for a while, but it wasn't recognized as a threat in water as a natural pollutant. And the EPA didn't create arsenic standards until the 1990s. The other thing that makes arsenic difficult is that it has no taste, no odor, no color. So it's very difficult to detect, and it doesn't cause many acute health effects. So people can start drinking the water and not notice the effects for many years. So that leads us into the health effects of arsenic. So the World Health Organization maximum level is 10 micrograms per liter, and half of the Bangladesh wells are over 50 micrograms per liter. So that just gives you a sense of how contaminated this area is. As I mentioned earlier, the predominant problem with arsenic is chronic exposure. So you don't really see too many acute effects, but over the span of many years, you get bladder, lung, and liver cancers, you get skin lesions, as you can see on the right, various stomach effects, and so it's difficult to quantify the effects of arsenic because it's a chronic pollutant, and there's all sorts of confounding factors. But it's estimated that there are about 43,000 deaths a year from arsenic in Bangladesh, and there are no known cures. It's really, avoiding arsenic is the only cure.
So once they recognized the problem, how did the government respond to knowing that nearly a quarter or even more at the time of their population was drinking this contaminated water? And in general, they haven't done much. The Bangladesh government itself has been pretty slow to address the issue. Right when the problem was discovered in the early 90s, they did have some smaller actions trying to help some people, but a majority of the people drinking contaminated water really had no help from the government, even to this day. For example, the standard for arsenic in Bangladesh is 50 micrograms per liter, but as Jack just stated, the health standard output by the World Health Organization is 10 micrograms per liter, showing that in Bangladesh, the government says it's acceptable to drink 5 times more than the international community generally accepts. And as I already mentioned, since 2006, the Bangladesh government has basically done nothing to try to address this problem.
So what has the international community done? After all, they were the ones that started this whole mess. So the World Bank led a pretty comprehensive effort to test wells throughout Bangladesh. This often led to wells being marked, but no other options or drinking water options were provided, so this wasn't a super effective campaign. UNICEF, which originally built most of these wells, found it very difficult to raise funds for any kind of project to save the situation, so they've not been very involved. The World Bank also got involved a little later and had 2 separate campaigns to bring cleaner drinking water sources to communities. But this only ended up reaching about 3 million people, so not a hugely effective solution, but in most cases they were building rainwater catchment systems and then deep tube wells. They found that when they were drilling on the order of 400 to 500 meters, there was very low arsenic in the water. But again, they didn't drill too many of these, and it didn't reach most of the population.
Yeah, so to just analyze a couple of the major reasons why this development project didn't succeed. First of all, the most obvious one is that they didn't test for arsenic when they initially drilled the wells, which you can somewhat explain as it wasn't really viewed as a common contaminant that was problematic at the time, but also there were a few studies throughout parts of India and other areas of the region where they did show that there were possibly some health effects from arsenic, so it definitely wasn't completely unknown. So it might have at least been something that was worth them looking into a little more. And another major thing that we think could have been done differently was that UNICEF and everyone involved in the implementation of this project didn't have phases or much testing of concept during the implementation. They sort of just went into the country and over as quickly as they could drilled a bunch of wells without sort of testing it on a smaller scale to make sure the concept would work. And this ties right into them choosing to be efficient and inexpensive over planning thoroughly. They decided to drill these hand-pumped wells that were pretty shallow rather than trying to make deeper wells that might have been a little safer. And this shows how sometimes it's worth it to take a harder path to have longer-term success.
Sweet.
What's the legacy of this project and the resulting arsenic contamination? First of all, the people of Bangladesh, this is something they still live with every single day, especially in the rural areas of the country. They're pretty much left with no option other than to drink this contaminated water. And this still leads to a lot of negative health effects. For example, thousands of people each year die from cancer, which is caused by their arsenic exposure. And there's even possibly longer-term health effects that are still unknown because they've only been drinking from these contaminated wells for 20-something years, and we don't know if there's any much longer chronic effects that it might have on the population. Additionally, I think something that the international community is going to remember a lot is that the government of Bangladesh hasn't really done much to fix the problem that its people is experiencing. And similarly, the organizations involved, like UNICEF, also have not done much since to try and help fix the problem, partly because it can be hard for them to find funding to fix something that they messed up in the first place. But at the same time, I think that's something that a lot of people will remember from this project, that the groups that caused it haven't done as much to try and solve it.
Mm-hmm. So looking to the future, what are some potential solutions to this very difficult problem? So one, as I mentioned earlier, deep wells in the area show low levels of arsenic. So that is a potential solution that's been implemented at a small scale, as is rainwater catchment. In addition, there's lots of emerging ways to filter and purify water that has arsenic. We'll get to that on the next slide. But either way, we're going to need like increasing governmental and international awareness of the problem to obtain funding. There's really no cheap way to fix this problem. So here's a closer look at arsenic filtration. This is still an emerging area of chemical engineering, but there's a lot of promising technologies out there. So reverse osmosis is generally considered the most cost-effective solution. You can see on the table here that it's has a very high efficiency, like approaching 95%, and it's applicable in a variety of pHs and different water conditions. Another solution is precipitation, using like various coagulants to precipitate out the arsenic and then remove it. That does have the problem of introducing a waste stream, so you have to deal with all this arsenic waste that you create, but it is an effective solution. Ion exchange is another solution that's been explored with some effectiveness. Activated carbon tends to remove about 40 to 70% of arsenic, but that's also on the table. There are some future solutions that have been looked at, especially for developing countries that don't have as many resources for reverse osmosis and the above technologies. So one interesting one, there's a paper in 2014 looking at iron impregnated biochar. So this is something that could be created from agricultural waste in a developing country. And so it's still an emerging technology, but it could be very effective in the future. Another solution is using UV light and then adding iron. This is shown to be an effective, low-tech way to precipitate arsenic out of water. But again, a lot of these are pretty untested, so it might be a few decades before these can be implemented on the ground.
Yeah, and then just to go over a couple lessons that we at Engineers Without Borders might be able to take away from this failed development project. First, the most obvious one is just to consider some non-traditional contaminants. So things that you might not necessarily test for in every regular water quality test. You should be analyzing like the geography and the culture of your surroundings to consider what other contaminants could possibly be present in the water sources. Similarly, it's very important to have a phased development plan. So rather than going in and doing everything you want to do at once, trying to split it up into smaller sections so that you can test at various times and make sure things are working as you intend them to. And finally, it's also important to stay involved with the project after it's completed. So for us, as we're involved with different communities in Kenya and in the Dominican Republic, even though we might finish implementing something that we agreed to build with them, it's always good to stay connected, maybe just to offer technological advice or funding if they need anything, possibly, but just not completely ignoring them as soon as we're done with the project is something that can be very helpful.
Yeah. Sweet. So thanks for following along. Here's a look at our references if you want to learn more about this topic. And yeah, cheers.